It's not enough for the European Union to regulate. They also need to be able to innovate. It doesn't necessarily feel like we're building the future. And I hope that with artificial intelligence, brilliant minds and individuals will get empowered to implement their ideas, their visions, and come up with new cool products and services that will move away Europe from the industrial age to the digital age. Artificial intelligence is being used by malicious actors to try to influence political debates. If people get their political information from AI systems, for example, asking ChatGPT, who should I vote for? These systems are not neutral by design. And we also know from history that populists are usually better at using new technologies for their goals than established parties.
In this episode of The European Angle, we explore Europe's role in the global AI landscape. What makes Switzerland and the EU uniquely positioned to shape AI governance? Can Europe strike the right balance between innovation and regulation? Or will it fall behind the US and China?
We speak with Nicolas Zahn about the geopolitical dimensions of AI, the risks of overregulation, and how Europe can maintain digital sovereignty while relying on foreign tech. We also dive into how AI could impact democracy, economic inclusion, and the future of work, and what young people can do to shape this digital future responsibly.
Whether you're curious about AI ethics, European tech policy, or the future of democracy in the digital age, this episode is for you. Switzerland is or has been a leading hub in many spheres, such as diplomacy and innovation. From your perspective, what unique role could Switzerland play in shaping global AI governance, especially compared to the US and China?
I think the biggest potential would lie in leveraging International Geneva as a convening location for AI governance discussions. So far, this discussion has been pretty fragmented. We've seen initiatives within the United Nations, but those were mostly taking place in New York. We've seen national approaches to AI governance, particularly in China, the US, but also recurring summits like the AI safety summits that started in the UK, were held in France this year, I think, and will be happening in Switzerland, actually, in Geneva in 2027. And Switzerland here has the potential to strategically think about what kind of organizations do we need to, and what kind of stakeholders do we need to attract to Geneva to have constructive debate on AI governance.
In one of your articles, you mentioned the UK as Europe's AI research powerhouse, and that other European countries should strengthen their relationship with the UK to benefit from their AI research. In fact, Microsoft just announced a couple of days ago that they will invest $30 billion in UK AI infrastructure. But shouldn't European companies build the AI infrastructure and tools instead of relying on American enterprises?
That's a very good question, and actually the argument that I'm currently seeing being debated, whether the massive investments by US tech companies in the United Kingdom are taking the UK towards a step of digital independence or digital sovereignty, or whether this is actually just buying sort of their loyalty and tying them even closer to the US. I would prefer as well to have good relations with big technology companies because there's just no way around them, but at the same time be wary of creating new dependencies. So within the European Union, and I think we're seeing this already with specific investments and proposed policies, the idea is to build up a European tech stack and to further the independence of US technology companies, and also establish the European Union as sort of a third pole on the global scale between the US-America-led approach and the Chinese approach.
So you You just talked about Europe becoming
Yeah.
this thing between the US and and China. Do you feel we're approaching that reality?
I guess for a really long time, the European Union relied a bit heavily on the so-called Brussels effect. So the idea that the European Union is such an attractive market that they only need to care about regulation. And because they are such a big market, those rules and these regulations that they create will also have effects outside the European Union. We've seen that, for example, with the GDPR on data privacy, where technology companies sort of adjusted their products to be in line with European regulations. But now, when it comes to AI governance, we're seeing a lot of conflicts or potential conflicts with this, and a lot of criticism, even from people that were working on creating the European regulations. So I think it's not enough for the European Union to regulate. They also need to be able to innovate. And this is something where the whole continent has fallen behind the US and China and also other regions of the world because they have not properly invested in infrastructure and creating their own companies in the past.
And what makes it difficult for new companies to emerge in Europe?
I guess there's let's I guess there's at least three aspects. The first is that we still have lots of fragmentation. So even though the European project was focused on integrating different national markets into one big European market, we have the free movement of capital, of people, of goods and services. But if you look at the digital economy, there has actually been a project called the Digital Single Market that was concluded already a couple of years ago. But still, if you're a digital company, you have varying regulations and different approaches in different European countries. So, in fact, you do have a fragmented market, and that makes it pretty difficult for smaller companies. The second one is related to regulations that are effective in all of Europe because they just come with the way that these regulations are formulated. They create a high burden because you need to have lots of documentation, you need to do lots of assessments, etc. And actually, the argument has been made already with the GDPR that happened a couple of years ago that this only strengthens the position of big players in the market because they can afford to comply, while smaller companies might say, well, it's not even worth it. Of course, European regulations try to address this issue with specific regulations, for example, saying that regulations like the Digital Markets Act only apply to you if you already have a certain size, so that startups can actually develop and be built. But the third hurdle is the lack of capital. If you look at Silicon Valley, the way that companies are able to raise funds there is completely different than the one we have in Europe. And it's not that we wouldn't have the money necessarily. It's more of a mindset problem where you're only starting in the last couple of years, only started seeing this venture capitalist idea of funding business models, even if they don't turn a profit, right? Because if you look at a couple of companies that are now household names like Uber, they haven't turned a profit in almost a decade. Even Palantir only recently started making profits. And I think you'd be very hard pressed to find investors in Europe that would be comfortable with this, whereas American venture capitalists are a bit more open to that idea. And I'm not saying that that's necessarily a good thing, but it's one factor that could explain why American startups seem to be more successful. At the same time, I would not be too negative about the prospects of European technology companies. While it is true that the list is relatively short, especially if you start comparing market capitalization, you can easily see Europe being really thwarted by the American companies and the Asian, especially Chinese companies in terms of size and scale. But European companies and founders have shown that even when it comes to AI, they are actually able to innovate and come up with interesting products. Just think about Mistral, for example, as a European alternative to ChatGPT, but also think about Helsing, the arms startup working on AI in defense. So I'm not completely hopeless.
And what could be done to change this mindset of venture capitalists?
Well, it's difficult to answer because I'm not necessarily sure that we would actually want to go in the direction that the US was going. I would focus more in Europe about lifting the regulatory burden for startups, and also think hard about the incentives for bigger companies to innovate. Why are they not doing this? I mean, we have huge technology companies, especially in the industrial area. Why are they not being more innovative in the digital space? There must be some reason behind this. I don't know the answer, but as a policymaker, I would try to figure out why they don't manage to be as innovative as other companies. And I think it's less a question of money, because we have huge industrial companies that do have a lot of money, but they nevertheless fail to innovate properly because they're probably more focused, given market incentives, on just keeping their market share.
Many people worry that strict regulation might slow down innovation, while others fear that without rules, AI could harm society. How do you think policymakers should strike the right balance between enabling innovation and enforcing safeguards?
Yes. So this is not only a question in Europe. You're right. You have these discussions also in the US. You even have them in China for different reasons. I would recommend the book by Mustafa Suleyman, who was working at DeepMind, because he has written a big book on this, where he basically calls figuring out this balance between innovation and regulation one of the big, or if not even the biggest challenge of the 21st century, not only regarding artificial intelligence, but also bioengineering or biological advances. Look, for me, it's a false dichotomy to say we can either have innovation or we can have safe products. I don't think those things are mutually exclusive. I do think that if you regulate poorly, then you can stifle innovation. But at the same time, I would not say that this is an argument to say we don't want any rules. We would not accept this in other industries as well. If you think about cars, we are totally fine with having strict laws that enforce certain safety standards. If you think about the airline industry or the pharmaceutical industry, it's true that those are heavily regulated industries, but it's also true that they're highly innovative because we keep coming up with new medicine and new drugs. So I don't think that the regulation and innovation are mutually exclusive, but it needs to be done in the right way. And this brings us to one of the big challenges, that the people writing the laws often don't understand the technology that they're trying to regulate, and vice versa. The technology companies don't necessarily appreciate the political questions or issues that their products or services might raise. So I think Europe would really benefit from encouraging know-how exchange and information sharing between the technology sector and policymakers.
You think many digital initiatives of the European Union failed because there wasn't this know-how exchange between these two stakeholders you just mentioned?
Do you have any specific initiatives in mind, or?
Well, I'm just considering that the EU hasn't really, after my research, hasn't been able to really bring AI forward as much as it might have been or expected to.
You have to be careful here not to start a general debate about the effectiveness of the European Union. But I mean, a recurring issue that you see is that we have very high ambitions, but then it basically falls back into the purview of the member states, and then it becomes a domestic politics issue. And there we have lots of difficulties, right? Because many, especially big European countries, are heavily indebted, so they don't have the financial means to really invest a lot. At the same time, some you could call it national business models of the last couple of years or maybe even the last decade are coming under pressure. So if you think about Germany, the country has really benefited the last decade from being able to export a lot of industrial goods and import a lot of cheap energy. And with the war in the Ukraine and the attack from Russia, we really and also China rethinking whether they actually want to have German cars or whether it's not better for them to build their own, especially electric vehicles. You see that these business models of certain nations in the European Union are coming under pressure, and that makes it very difficult to have not just an aligned vision within all the member states of the European Union, but actually act on that mission. And particularly if we think about AI, and this is where the article that I wrote, you mentioned earlier, comes into play. The UK would really be an asset for European Union when it comes to the development of AI. So maybe they figure out a way of walking back the whole Brexit separation. But yeah, that's going to be even more difficult now that the US has strengthened relationships in terms of AI with the UK.
You argue Europe should avoid an AI arms race and instead focus on cybersecurity maturity. What does that maturity look like in practice?
You could go through technical standards like the ISO standard 27001 or other certifications. Nevertheless, if somebody wants to attack you in cyberspace and it's really a competent actor with lots of resources, state-sponsored cyber attacks, etc., they probably will get through. But what I find a bit frustrating is that there are really basic measures that organizations and individuals can take to improve their cybersecurity, like doing backups, like using multi-factor authentication, like using password managers, like things that have been around for decades and are also well known in the cybersecurity community. And yet organizations prioritize pushing new products, trying new software, integrating new features like AI into their organization. And security is always a bit of an afterthought. I was once at a conference where somebody way older than me complained that he's been attending these conferences and saying the same thing for 40, 50 years. And he compared it to the auto industry and basically said, just imagine you buy a car, and just as you leave the car salesman, he tells you, oh, by the way, we don't install any brakes. You have to buy them separately. And that's kind of how IT feels like, because you get the software, but security is usually an afterthought. There's a whole second market for cybersecurity products. You need to buy firewalls. A couple of years ago, you still needed to buy antivirus software. So there's a lot of responsibility that the industry is offloading to us as the customers, right? Because it's your responsibility to make sure that you update your system. It's your responsibility to create backups. And I'm totally fine with asking customers for certain responsibilities. But in terms of cybersecurity, it just feels like that we're offloading quite a bit of responsibility that should actually be with the people that design and create those systems in the first place. And AI is only going to make this worse, because AI is such a trend topic that everybody fears that they're missing out at the moment. So if you now want to convince somebody to maybe wait with the adoption of a certain software for security reasons, or you tell them that they need to spend additional money because you want to do a proper review of the software code, etc., this is a very tough sell, because people equate, it's a bit like the innovation regulation debate. People equate wrongly, in my perspective, cybersecurity with being costly and being slow and making you lose out regarding your competitors. But in the medium to long term, I'd say the inverse is true. If you don't care about cybersecurity now, you're just going to have to pay a high fine later on.
And so maybe we can talk now a bit about geopolitics of AI. What scenarios do you foresee if countries race ahead with very different approaches to AI governance? Could this fragment the global digital economy?
I think that fragmentation is already here because we have the Great Firewall in China. We now see more and more examples of Russia trying to isolate its internet and also all the digital services. You might have seen the release of a new application where President Putin said that all Russians now need to use that application for messaging, no more WhatsApp, etc. We also have similar debates in European countries where French ministers were asked to uninstall all software that is not created by a French company and instead use a messenger for state employees that they develop themselves. And of course, also in the US, you see that fragmentation. So I think this is already there, and I fear that it's only going to get worse. One scenario is also that we will see a return of the state as the most important actor of international affairs. What that means is that the question of how to regulate digital services will move back into so-called multilateral institutions like the United Nations, because for the last 20 years or a bit more than 20 years, the question of what to do about the political consequences of digital technologies, it's not like we did not debate this, but we did not necessarily debate this in the United Nations. We built up new institutions for this, and those new institutions were special because more people than just state representatives were allowed in those discussions. We call this the so-called multi-stakeholder discussions because you no longer had just diplomats from states there. You had people from technology companies. You had researchers from universities. You had activists from NGOs and civil society. And they were all getting together and sort of speaking on the same eye level on how to regulate AI, on how to regulate the internet when it comes to hate speech on social media, etc. And that's also why we don't have, for example, international treaties, or at least not many of them, because those discussions were happening outside in a different arena. And the most likely scenario that I see now with the arms race towards AI is that states want to recover their power and make themselves once more the only actor that can talk about the regulation of that technology.
You've been talking about the people, and my question now is, how does AI influence citizens and their political behavior? Many European countries now face a transition phase between being a democracy and being an authoritarian state. And how could AI be used to spread misinformation by these emerging authoritarian regimes? And what can we do against that?
While I'm a bit skeptical, I'm also not necessarily an AI doomer. I think personally that technology still is a net positive, and also digital technologies can empower the individual and hence could be a positive aspect of liberal democracies as well. At the same time, we cannot overlook the fact that artificial intelligence is being used by malicious actors to try to influence political debates with fake news, with chatbots. We also know that from research done, for example, by Algorithm Watch, that if people get their political information from AI systems, for example, asking ChatGPT, who should I vote for? These systems are not neutral by design. So there's really an issue there. And I think for liberal democracies, the big challenge will be to figure out a way how we manage to get information and how we have constructive debate in the digital age, because we have not solved this problem. We didn't solve it with social media. We've potentially made it worse with social media. And we certainly haven't even started to think about, okay, in the age of AI, how do we get information? How do we argue? Because there's also very interesting research out there that experiments with having AI-assisted debates, where you have an AI system that gets your position or your questions on a political subject and then matches you with somebody of the opposing view, or exposes you to new arguments, or finds flaws in the arguments that convinced you. So it's not like AI is necessarily bad for democracies. I think we could build very interesting systems and platforms with AI that could help constructive dialogue in a democracy. But this doesn't happen naturally. So it needs an active effort on our side.
You have an idea how this effort could look like?
I mean, I wrote in 2016 about a way of having a platform that was particularly from the Swiss perspective, because we have these votes on initiatives and referendums, right? So we have a simple yes, no at the end. But the interesting part, in my opinion, happens before you make your decision on yes, no, right? Because you get the Abstimmungsbüchlein with the list of arguments for both sides. And the idea of that platform was basically to collectively co-create that leaflet and gather arguments. You would see the arguments for the yes side, you would see the arguments for the no side. You could react to those arguments. You could say, oh yeah, this convinced me, I'm now switching over, or no, I want to respond to that argument because I found a flaw. And AI could be assisting in the background there. We've seen this actually already in practice, for example, in Taiwan. They used AI-supported decision-making systems. For example, the platform Polis, POL.is, to gather the thoughts from the population and help basically draft from the bottom up a new legislation on the regulation of Uber and other ride-sharing apps. So it's not like this is science fiction. This is already happening in other countries, and I think we should experiment with this in Switzerland as well.
You warned that unresolved fundamental questions can erode public trust in digital projects. What lessons can our policymakers learn from past controversies like e-voting or the e-ID in Switzerland?
I mean, if you think back, for example, to the COVID times, when Switzerland, Swiss universities created a really brilliant way of contact tracing that was privacy preserving, that was data friendly, data minimizing, in that sense, data friendly, not collecting data, only collecting the data that was necessary. And it was such a good approach that Apple and Google both integrated that feature into their operating systems for their mobile devices. But what did the Swiss government do? Basically go out there and say, yeah, well, I don't really like this app. So, this undermines the trust, because we have, as you said, a widening gap between people that understand the technology, or at least think that they understand the technology, and the people just not caring about it. And I can understand why you would not care about it, because it's also designed in a way for you not to understand it, right? You don't necessarily need to understand how your car works. You don't need to understand how your oven works. You just need to know how to use it. But even there, I'd say, because digital technologies are so important and so pervasive, basically permeating every aspect of our everyday lives, I think the key challenge that states really need to tackle, and need to tackle fast, is build up a solid knowledge throughout all members of society about digital technologies. And we're seeing this already with adjustments in educational plans, for example, but we know that these kinds of changes take a lot of time, right? You first need to have all the students educated, and then they grow up. So there we're talking decades. What I'm imagining is more of a general push to educate all of society. And there's an interesting example for this in Estonia, where they did the so-called Tiger Leap campaign in the 90s, where basically they went from one village to the other, gathered everybody on the town square, and then created an email account for every citizen and showed them how to use it, etc. I mean, of course, now we would need to do something different. Maybe, I don't know, have a first interaction with a chatbot and educate people about the limitations and risks of that technology, but also how they could use it proactively. Now that we have a Swiss open model with Apertus, you could use probably this to showcase these kinds of trainings and knowledge sessions. So I think we really need to start building up a broad knowledge base within the population on digital technologies, because that first makes it easier to create good policy, because if policymakers understand it, and if citizens understand that digital technologies actually raise political questions, then it suddenly becomes attractive for politicians to talk about digital policy, because at the moment it's still very much a niche issue. It's a bit like talking about environmental protection in the 70s. Only weird people would care about this, but it's really something that affects all of society. And once people understand this, they will also challenge politicians and ask them, okay, you want to have my vote, then I want to know, do you support age verification on the internet or not? Or what's your view on AI regulation? So I really think we need this educational push really soon.
Do you think this gap between the ones who understand tech and the ones who don't make Switzerland, as an example, slower in digitalizing itself?
Not necessarily, because I think almost every country has that gap. I mean, it's the same in the US, right? There, it's just that the people who understand it are also the people actually creating the technologies. This is a bit something that's a bit frustrating about Switzerland, but it's mostly due just to the small size of our market and our nation. We always keep leading in research indicators, in digital competitiveness indices, but it's not like there are many Swiss big companies out there or interesting startups. There are a bunch of smaller startups that then get acquired by European or American funds or companies. But I don't think that this is the main problem in Switzerland. The main problem with digital transformation in Switzerland, particularly of the public sector, is mostly maybe sounds a bit counterintuitive, but our institutions are already very good. So there's not a lot of pressure to change. If you think of Estonia, they were a dictatorship for twice ever since independence, first the Nazis, then the Soviet Union. So when they finally became independent the second time in the 90s, they basically started from scratch. They didn't have any institutions that they wanted to keep. They wanted to build everything new. So they started reimagining the state with the digital technology already in mind. Whereas we have, for over 250 years, institutions that work really, really well. I don't know how many interactions with the public sector you have, but usually it goes very smoothly, right? It's not that often that you complain about having to deal with an inefficient bureaucracy. So there's not as much pressure to innovate or change things, because things are pretty well the way that they are. But the second big challenge is certainly the federal system. You can also see that in the international comparison. Countries that don't have federal systems have an easier time of digital transformation, just because everything's central, right? You make one change, it affects everybody immediately. We cannot do that here, and I'm not saying that that's necessarily a bad thing. Federalism has lots of advantages, and I definitely also want to keep it as a core feature of Switzerland. But in terms of digital transformation, it can be a disadvantage. If every canton wants to reinvent electronic identity for themselves, or if you have 26 different data formats to exchange information about tax returns, this is not super efficient. But we have this problem in other aspects as well, education, medicine, and we figured it out there as well. It just takes a bit longer. So we'll get there.
As Switzerland has all of the initiatives and referendums, do you think that the people not understanding technology and therefore maybe mistrusting it might be stood in the way of a more digitalized and more efficient Switzerland?
Unfortunately, I don't think we have that many initiatives that deal with advancing digital transformation. Or, I mean, we had the vote on EID. That was basically the only one, right? So it's not like lots of initiatives would have failed. It's more the vision or the ambition level that is lacking. I still remember one of the federal councillors saying, when the first vote was happening on the first approach or proposal for electronic identity, that, we as the state, we cannot do this and we do not want to do this. And I think it's more of this mindset problem that there is a lack of ambition to reimagine or imagine how a digital state in Switzerland could look like or should look like. And that's also why we don't have the initiatives or referenda. But of course, this goes back to the educational problem. If people do not understand it, it's a healthy position to be skeptical. And my hope is that through education, it's not about marketing. It's not about convincing them to have one specific project and never criticize it or find it super fantastic. It's about building up the know-how so they for themselves can form a good opinion about certain proposals. What I do not want to have is a situation where we keep on suggesting ideas and people are like, I don't understand this, I don't like this, because this would then be a problem that keeps us stuck.
And how could such an informational or educational campaign look like? I feel like especially elderly people aren't that educated on technology, especially AI. And how could we ensure that also elderly people are educated and that we have their trust in the technology?
Well, if I had the answer to that, I'd be doing it myself. I guess it must be. Of course, you should probably start with the students, but you need to come up with, I don't know, free courses or Volkshochschulen, something like that, for people that are already in the workforce or maybe even have already worked and are now senior citizens. We figured this out for other issues as well. One aspect there is certainly having good journalism, because people, although the media is under constant pressure and criticism, but people still like to consume news, right? And I think tech journalism plays a really important role in educating people about technologies, about digital technologies, and specifically about the political questions that digital technologies raise. So we should focus on education for the students, and we should focus on good tech journalism for everybody else.
How can Europe ensure that AI-driven economic growth is inclusive and doesn't deepen regional or social divides?
Yeah, I don't have an answer for that, because at the end, this goes down to general economic policies, redistribution systems, etc. The thing I would say is, I hope that AI will turn out to be a technology like the personal computer, so that it's not centralized or only in the hands of a few companies, but actually empowering the individual to make more out of their lives, and in that sense, be inclusive.
I think it's really important that we make sure that everyone can benefit from this transition and these innovations. Because when we look at the US, for example, Elon Musk, who also has his XAI company in this AI space, has so much influence on the government, and I think we really need to ensure that something like that doesn't happen in Europe. Um, Now for the next question, will new industries emerge or get dominant in Europe during the AI era?
I hope so. Yeah, I hope that the AI will help us move from an industrial society into an information society, because Europe was really stuck in, I mean, stuck sounds a bit maybe too negative, because it was a success story for a really long time, right? But if you think about European companies, it's mostly industrial companies, it's car manufacturing, it's maybe weapons, it's maybe services as well, but conservative services like financial, insurance, education. So it doesn't necessarily feel like we're building the future. And I hope that with artificial intelligence, brilliant minds and individuals will get empowered to implement their ideas, their visions, and come up with new cool products and services that will move away Europe from the industrial age to the digital age.
Yeah. And do you feel like now is the perfect time for Europe to transition from this industrial age or even deindustrialized age to a digital one where social capital is the most important economic factor?
Transitions are hard because transitions are usually costly and they're also usually pretty disruptive. If you think back to the idea of having an energy transition towards green energy, that didn't work at all, right? And it's a bit the same with moving from an industrialized society to an information society because there's so many unanswered questions. If artificial intelligence really does end up being so much more effective than people will, okay, maybe it can actually help us to fight off some of the demographic challenges that we have with populations that get older and fewer people actually entering the workforce, which has started the whole migration debate.
So, how can we minimize the destructive impact of this transformation?
What's probably a good idea is to have as many people experimenting with the technology and trying it out for themselves and building up a certain know-how and expertise with this. Um, I wouldn't want to leave it just to a couple of people because they say, "Ah, yeah, you don't understand anyways." Um, I think that it's one of those technologies that really affects everybody, and that's why everybody should be involved in all the discussions about regulation and innovation and using it, instead of just leaving it to a couple of companies or people.
Do you think if we were to leave it to a couple of companies or people that a scenario could occur where this minority would amass such a high proportion of the wealth in the world and the rest would kind of fall into a semi-poverty?
No, I really don't like all these dystopic scenarios and also this idea of artificial general intelligence or super intelligence, all this talk about P doom, the probability that AI will kill us all. I think this will more like the more likely scenario is humans making bad decisions and not an AI taking over the world. So I don't really believe in that kind of scenario.
How do you see the workforce in Europe going forward with AI?
I think AI could actually be beneficial because we have lots of pressure on the labor market due to our demographics. So we have many people that are leaving the workforce. We have not that many people joining the workforce. At the same time, it's not like we have very productive societies, right? The economies in the European Union, it's not like they're necessarily shrinking, but they're certainly not growing the way that they used to either. We have highly indebted countries. We have lots of expenditures and investments that would now be needed in infrastructure, in defense. So it's really a tough challenge for many countries to manage their finances. And maybe AI will really help us there if it turns out to be such a productivity gain as we imagine. Then it can alleviate some of these pressures.
And what happens to the people that can't keep up with the transition of the workforce? So, are they more likely to vote for populist or far right parties because they feel left behind? And what does that mean for society and maybe also politics in general if people are left behind?
I mean, in general, it's a well-known and well-observed tendency that if people feel like the parties that are currently in power are not serving their interests or are not doing anything for them, and if you get into this whole idea of almost nihilism, where people want to say, I have a bad life, and now I basically want to ruin it for everybody else as well, then you will have probably more support for populist parties, be it on the extreme left or the extreme right. But that's not necessarily a problem of AI. That's just a problem of poorly managing a country. So populism by itself is not necessarily bad. It's more of a signal that the people in charge didn't manage to live up to their expectations that the voters put into them, right? Of course, you can make the argument that AI helps certain parties more than it helps others, because with all this fake news and focus on emotions and rage, AI can help there. And we also know from history that populists are usually better at using new technologies for their goals than established parties. Um, but nevertheless, I think we've had this discussion about populism in Europe now for quite a while. And we also have some countries where we have populist governments, and we see that it's very different still. It's not always the same. Some populist governments get sort of tamed once they are in power. Others try to continue on the course that they've put out during their campaigns. But this, for me, doesn't really have to do a lot with AI.
Many people speculate a big loss of the white collar workforce and people switching to more hands-on jobs because of the
Yep.
replaceability of AI. Do you see this to be something that will happen?
I mean, who's to say that AI and advances in robotics will not make carpenters obsolete in 10 years? Of course, you've always had this tendency of um, basically attacking if you have sort of a job distribution, then usually disruptive technologies target the big pie in the big part of the pie in the middle, and at the very top you're sort of safe, and at the very bottom you're also sort of safe. So on the one hand, you will have the return to artisanal carpentry, fashion design, that kind of stuff, of course. But this will not help. You cannot employ a whole economy of carpenters. This will only work for a couple of people. And same at the top. I'm just not. I'm just not really buying into this replacement theory when it comes to the labor market, because if you think of jobs, they're basically a collection of individual tasks, and maybe AI replaces certain tasks, but that just means that the job profile is different now. It doesn't necessarily mean that the whole job is gone. And we see this specifically in software development. Just a couple of days ago, I saw a panel discussion with the CEO of Anthropic, because he was challenged by the moderator. Hey, you said 6 months ago that in 6 months' time, so today, 90% of software code will be written by AI, but you still employ all these people. Have you lied to us? And then he answered, well, no, I didn't say that we're going to cut positions or that we're going to let go of our software engineers. It's just that their job profile has shifted. They are maybe still coding a little bit, but most of the code is being written by AI. So their new role is to manage the AI systems. They're basically becoming managers of teams of AI agents that are writing software code instead of writing the code themselves. But it's not like their job is gone suddenly.
So, if you had to advise young listeners on one key challenge of the AI in the next decade, whether economic, ethical, or political, what would it be and why?
I wouldn't necessarily say educate them on the challenge. I would just really encourage everybody to try to learn as much about the topic as possible and do that mostly with practice, because that's how I got into IT, just by experimenting with those systems. That's also how I try to keep more or less up to date on AI now, by just using it, because that you will have lots of moments where you think this is magic and it's really surprising you, maybe putting a smile on your face or making you scared. But then you keep digging deeper and you start scratching, you go beyond scratching the surface. And then you also realize, these tools also have limitations, they also have risks. And then over time, you start figuring out how you can use them to your advantage. So I would just encourage everybody to try to play around with it. Of course, in a responsible way.
Do you think if someone's attend a uni the next few years or university, do you think they should switch from their path that they had in mind because they feel like their job could be threatened by artificial intelligence?
No, I wouldn't. I mean, we've had this debate even way before AI. I mean, AI as a term already goes back to the 1950s, so that's not new anyways. But we already had that debate pre-ChatGPT, even pre-IBM Watson and the whole machine learning thing. When I went to university, there was already, oh, but we need X, so you need to study X, and then in 3 years' time, it's something completely different. I would say you should study what, of course, not only what interests you, but I wouldn't throw away all my dreams and interests just because currently we're talking about this. I mean, 5 years ago, we talked about blockchain. I mean, a lot of people are still talking about it, but I would not have switched my university degree to pursue a degree in blockchain just because of this. And I also wouldn't do the same now with AI. So I wouldn't believe the people that tell you everybody needs to become a software engineer because you can learn how to code and you can learn a lot about software engineering without studying computer science. At the same time, I also wouldn't listen to the people that say, oh, we'll have universal basic income and everybody can become an art historian, because that's also probably not going to work out. So I feel if you're smart and diligent and hardworking, things will work out eventually anyways. So we should not overestimate the importance of choosing a certain university degree.
As students and young citizens, many of us want to shape the digital future responsibly. Beyond learning to code and these CS skills, what other, for example, political, economic, or ethical skills should we develop to make a real impact in the AI era?
I think one of the most important competencies or sets of skills is communication. Because even if you're the most brilliant engineer and you can come up with a new program or a new algorithm, but you cannot communicate to people what this thing is doing or why you built it, you don't have a good story to tell, then it's just going to go unnoticed, or it's going to be way behind on the potential. And the same goes for educated citizens, because part for me for the communication skills is not just sending, but also critically receiving and evaluating information that you hear. And I feel that especially in a world where we have abundance of information, right? So before the internet, the challenge was to get information, to get data. Now we don't have that challenge because there's so much data out there. Now the challenge is to make sense of this data. And I would also count that as part of communication skills. And that's super relevant and important, in addition to the technical skills.
Okay, so thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us today. Your insights really helped us understand the complexities behind these developments and gave us a lot to think about. We really appreciate you being part of the conversation.
Thanks very much for doing this. This is really cool.